You're looking at a picture of the world, and there is a hurricane. There's a little spiral up here. This is getting into the hurricane season, and the Arctic or the mid-latitude cyclonic disturbances are getting rarer. But we had an interesting thing going on this past winter, and the interesting thing that we had was the outbreak of polar air. We started hearing a new word on the radio and on the TV, that when every time we'd have a polar outbreak of bitterly cold air, they would say, it's the polar. How many, raise your hand if you'd never heard of a polar vortex before this year? Did they just invent them? Or did they just start talking about them? Always we've had a vortex at each pole. That's the way the world works. Sort of an interesting thing went on this past year, however. January the 6th, we're looking on this picture at very cold air. It's blue or purple over the United States and Canada. Very cold over parts of China. And very warm over Africa. Still warm up where they're on the Olympic side for the Winter Olympics. And above freezing still at the Arctic Circle in Norway and Sweden. 6th of January, above freezing in Norway and Sweden. 6 below here. Some nights would soon be 20 below here. Above freezing at the Arctic Circle in Alaska. This is what went on with the polar vortex this year. Thank you. It was breaking into pieces. And we had warm places going up, very far north, cold places coming down. We used to just call them polar outbreaks. Polar outbreak is defined as you can follow the cold air all the way from the Arctic Circle straight down without any breaks to Missouri. Or if it's on the East Coast, to Virginia. This will happen sometimes not at all in the winter, but most of the time 2 or 3 times here. If we have 6 polar outbreaks, or now they would call them polar vortex events, we would have a harsh winter. We had 9. Our winter was harsh and a half this past year. I don't know if 9 breaks a record or not. I don't know how well we've kept records on that. But that was the 9 polar outbreaks. Since then, we have had 2 that also would qualify as polar outbreaks, but it's not so cold now, and since they don't go below freezing, they just give us a chilly week. They would have been polar outbreaks of a real nature if it had still been shorter days and frozen soil underneath them. So that's what goes on. Looking down from space onto the North Pole in the top center picture, you see a purple area on the planet. That is the polar vortex as it usually looks. This picture from a satellite was made in November of last year. Then by the time we got to the 5th of January, you see that blue area is broken into 2 zones and about 6 little vortexes. One of them right over Canada and the northern United States. Then in the lower left picture, you see in blue the cold and in red the warm. The bitterly cold over Canada and the U.S. and over Mongolia and parts of China. And above freezing at the North Pole in January. This hadn't happened since in the 50s, as near as I can tell. Because now we can see it quite well when it happens because satellites are keeping a record of it. In the 50s, somebody had to say, I believe it's above freezing up here, so they had to go up and check. But this kind of thing only happens maybe 1 year out of 60. And it does seem to come on somewhat of a cycle. I want to talk about those things a little bit. The extremes always happen when we have this thing called a La Nina. La Nina is a new term. The term's only been around since the 70s. El Nino's been around for centuries. The opposite of El Nino is La Nina by modern definition. When we have La Nina, the air, you might say associated with the polar jet stream, makes great undulations, waves as it goes around our planet, moving generally from west to east, and bringing down cold air, pushing up warm air, like you see on the purple line on the screen. The yellow line is the polar airflow in the polar jet stream, if you will, if we have an El Nino. It waves a little bit, but it doesn't have the great deep waves that cause the great outbreaks of cold air. We have more an average year when there's an El Nino, average at least in the deviations from normal. The high temperatures don't get as high, the low temperatures don't get as low as they do during a La Nina year. I'm going to say quite a bit about El Nino and La Nina. They do typical things. With the La Nina, it will bring cold air into the northern west coast of the United States and wetness into Oregon and that area, but perhaps be quite dry down in southern California, as it was this past couple of years, and across toward Texas, and then be wet in the Ohio River Valley in the winter. Will be cold, typically, and those are the things La Nina usually does. This is connected with another thing that has to do with harshness of winter, and it's called the North Atlantic Oscillation. I don't know how many times I told my children, quit complaining about the winter. You should have seen the winters when I was a kid. Dad, don't Dad me. I've got data. If you look at your TV, you can see down here how harsh the winters were back in the 50s and the 60s, how mild some of them were and how harsh they were. My kids had this kind of harshness and mildness. My grandkids are saying to their parents, "Oh, we have weather like Grandpa had. We've got it a lot tougher than you did, Dad and Mom. You guys, you can tell your mom, you'll be telling the truth. You've got harder winters than she did." She said, "No way. Don't you say that to me, young children." We do go through a cycle. This was I guess the valley of having the cold, harsh winters was around 1965. The peak of warm winters, or not harsh winters, not necessarily warm, came in the years around 95. So some 60 to 95s, 30 years between them. It takes something like between 40 to 55 years to go from very cold winters through warm and back to cold again. It has to do with where the jet stream flows, but also where the Gulf Stream, the warm water of the ocean, goes when it leaves the Gulf of Mexico. Does it hug close to the U.S. coast, or does it head for Portugal? Or is it somewhere in between? And to make that trip from the years it was close to our coast to being heading for Portugal takes at least 20 years to make the trip across, and it starts its way back. This is why you often have heard that if they're having harsh winters in Old England, they're having mild ones in New England, and vice versa. And it's because of this North Atlantic Oscillation. That is where the polar air is allowed to come down and where the air from the milder climes is making its way north. And so it affects our winters. The reason I'm talking about it is because we are going into 20, 25 years of harsh winters such as we had before 1982 back into the 1950s. So this type of condition is back with us in the winters, and also there's some effect in the summers about harshness. The summers are going to have a bigger effect on us agriculturally for production of crops, but both the winter and the summer for production of livestock. U.S. corn yield. since 1983 on the chart, has a trend of going up. We can thank the plant breeders for that uptrend, and of course the crop management for fertilizing and managing the land and managing a crop in a way that allows it to meet its potential and increase in yield. The trend line yield back in the early 80s, in the late 70s, was around 100 bushels the acre for corn in the United States, and now the trend line is 160. The trend is the best straight line drawn through 30 years of records of U.S. corn yield. We also have a trend line for soybean, trend line for cotton, trend line for the major crops that we consider commodity crops. I want you to notice, if you can see it on the chart, if you can't see it, I'll just tell you, that between the early 1980s and the mid-90s, we had great differences between yields from year to year for U.S. corn, also for soybeans, also for other things. These were called the volatile years. Volatile years in weather, in yield, in market conditions. These years had high variability. Then we went into a time of consistent yields, and the yields have stayed consistent up until a couple of years ago, very near the trend line. An interesting thing happened in 2004. We began a run of 6 years of above the trend yield. By definition, the yields should be above trend half the time, below half the time. But only once since we've been keeping records of crop yields in the United States have we had 6 consecutive years with the yield for the nation staying above the trend. The plant breeders were beginning to tell us, that's plant breeding. We have improved the crop so much, we're going to have to draw a whole new trend line up above the old one. And people were almost starting to believe them. They were believing it themselves. And then we got to 2010, and we had a below trend yield. And 11, and in 12 we had a drought. A drought. People around the world have always argued, it's a drought. No, it isn't. Yeah, it's a drought. I don't think so. We don't argue about it in the U.S. We don't have to argue about whether it's a drought or not. We've got Congress. And Congress passed a law. And they said it's a drought if the yield of the crop falls 10% below the trend or more. That's called decimating the crop, reducing it by 10%. When the crop is decimated, and they measure it county by county, they don't do it for the whole nation as one. When the crop is decimated, then everyone in that county that raises that crop is entitled to whatever relief is being provided that year by the USDA went for drought conditions. So these are the things that we endure. Occasionally we fall 10% below. It happened in 1983, it happened in 88, and it happened in 93, happened in 93. In 1993, people said that wasn't a drought, that was a flood. Well, anybody could see it was a flood, but since it cut the yield to 10% below trend, legally it was a drought. Just like anything is when it cuts the yield that much. Well, not only do we live in a country that can tell us when we have a drought, we're almost like Camelot. By law, droughts cannot last more than 9 years. Some places have said we've been having a drought for the last 20 years. Can't happen in America. We only have drought 9 years maximum by law. You already know about that because you looked at your crop insurance. Those of you that raise crops, and I assume that's most everyone. Crop insurance. Usually have this yield. I'm insured for this. If it falls to this, they pay me. The next year it's the same thing. They pay me, but a little less. Next year I get the same thing. They pay me a little less, a little less, a little less, a little less. After 9 years, what do I get if I have the same crop? Nothing. Droughts can only last 9 years. They can't go on for 10. By law, you see. Because if it lasts 10 years, that's not drought anymore. Now it's climate change. And we don't insure against climate change on your farm. We insure against drought. And you had 9 years to pack up and move your farm somewhere else, or to raise something that isn't affected by this type of climate now. Well, our climate changes. It has always changed. And it always will change. That's the main reason that we make our trend line 30 years of record. 30 years because it gets over little things that kind of stick around for 4 or 5 years, but really goes along with the maybe long-term climate change and the long-term changes in our crop production and things related to the crop production. Then the last thing I want you to notice off this chart is the drought we had in 2012, where we fell well below the trend line by more than 10%. For the first time that we'd fallen that low since 1993, and the first drought, the real drought, since 1988. And people say, is this the beginning of something? Let's look at that a little bit. Because yes, it is. Droughts tend to run in groups, or at least the volatile weather runs in groups of years. If you want to be profitable in agriculture, whether it's livestock production or crop production, you have to understand what is going on. For example, know where drought is. I'm showing a picture of the Drought Monitor here in the middle of this screen. And then you have to manage the risk associated with what's going on in your environment. That's the wonderful thing about risk. Risk can be managed. That's because risk has numbers. I listened to a fellow talking from the Board of Trade a few years ago, and he talked for 2 hours about managing risk in soybean production. At the end of the 2 hours, he said, any questions? No one was asking questions, so I asked a question. I said, you've told us to manage the risk for 2 hours. What is the risk right now of having a below trend line soybean yield? He said, I don't know. I said, what was the risk last year? What do you mean, what was the risk? It's risky. I said, risk has numbers. We need the numbers. I can manage anything with numbers. Is it a 70% chance of a below trend yield? A 70% chance of an above trend yield? A 10% chance of a low yield? What are the numbers? If I don't have numbers, it's not a risk, it's an uncertainty. Uncertainty has no numbers. All I can do with uncertainty is avoid it. Risk has numbers. I can manage anything with numbers. I drove my car down here today. In the trunk, I've got a spare tire and a jack and a wrench. And if I should have a flat tire, I can change it. And someone said, okay, why do you do that? I said, because I might have a flat tire. Is that a risk? I said, no, it's an uncertainty. How many miles have you driven since you had your last flat tire? More than 1/3 So you don't know the risk of having a flat tire. I said, nope, but I know that it could happen, so I got a spare tire. What if I'd driven down here in an Iowa State University car? They provide cars I can drive around if I want to. And if I look in the trunk, there's no spare tire. There's no jack. There's no wrench. I said, what if I have a flat tire? They said, have you got a cell phone? I said, sure, I got a cell phone. Call a garage and have them come out and fix your tire. And I said, why is that? And they said, because we buy 300 cars. Do you realize what it costs or what we save by saying, don't put that extra wheel and tire in there and jack and wrench? It saves us over $100 per car. for 300 cars. And we know how many flat tires or blowouts and so forth we have a year, and that we're money ahead to just have you call somebody to come out and help you. And anyway, it's going to be university people driving these cars, and they wouldn't know how to change a flat anyhow. So, they're managing the risk. They know the number of flat tires and the cost of taking care of one. And so they're saving us tax money by managing the risk, by say have somebody come to help you. In this case, it's better. I am just avoiding, personally, not the risk. You can't avoid risk. You can only manage it. It's always there. But I am avoiding the possibility of being stranded with a flat tire. This little figure that I've drawn here has got an 8% of the circle, it's called a pie chart, is green. At 8% says there's an 8% chance of having a record high yield in the year this was drawn for. This was drawn for corn, and it was drawn for corn during a La Nina a couple of years ago. I know that if a La Nina is going on, there's an 8% chance this nation could have a record high corn yield. It has happened. It could happen again. There's a 31% chance it could have a drought during a La Nina. There's a 70% chance that the yield will be below trend. Not necessarily a drought, but below the trend. And a 30% chance it'll be above trend. Just by knowing that, I can manage the yield risk, whether I'm buying corn to feed my animals or I'm producing corn to sell. I can manage it. Let me give you an example. I drive up in my pickup truck to the elevator. Out comes the co-op manager and he says, "Hey, Owen, I see you got corn in the bed of your pickup truck." I said, "Yep, how much you got there?" 100 bushels. "You want to sell it, don't you?" And I said, "I sure do." "What do you give me for it?" He said, "I'll give you $4.60. I said, "Great. Take 30 bushels of it." And he said, "What do you mean take 30 bushels? I thought you wanted to sell it all." I said, "I do want to sell it all, but not for $4.60 a bushel. At $4.60, I want to sell 30 bushels of it." "Why do you want to sell 30 bushels?" "Because here's the risk wheel. There's a 30% chance that the price is going to go down before harvest time of this year. And so I consider that 30 bushels of this 100 at risk. And so at the price you're offering, I will sell you that 30 bushels at $4.60. And he said, "Okay, what are you going to do after that? You're going to take your 70 bushels home? You're just going to keep it?" "No, I'm going to come back this same day next month with my 70 bushels that I've got left, and I'm going to say, I've got 70 bushels of corn for sale. Do you want to buy it? And you're going to give me a price. And if nothing's changed, you'll say $4.60 again. And I'll still know that the weather's the same, and there's still this much 30% chance of having the prices go down. And I'll sell you about 1/3 of the corn that I've got. By the time the summer's over, all the corn that's at risk is gone, and the corn that's got the sure thing of going up in price will be left. Maybe none will be left. Maybe I won't have sold any corn. It'll be all still there to sell when the price has gone up. I just put myself in the top 5% of everybody who sells corn. Or if I do it the other way around, in the top 5% of everybody who buys corn. Because I get rid of the crop that's at risk. I went to PTA meeting, and the principal of the school was talking about students at risk. And I was real interested to hear how he was going to get rid of those kids. That isn't how we treat students at risk. We try to rescue them. We get rid of the corn that's at risk. That's the way to handle it. So, risk management becomes an important thing. Now, there's a couple of reasons to manage the risk. One is so we make a profit on our crop, at least sometimes. Now, my mom was never interested in risk management. She said to me, Elwynn, I don't think we're any better off with our 200 bushel corn, this was 3 years ago, than we were in 1950 with our 50 bushel corn. I said, Mom, we're not. She said, why is that, Elwynn? I said, Mom, it's because in 1950 you and Dad sold our 50 bushels of corn for the cost of production. And this year, 3 years ago, you sold our 200 bushels for the cost of production. And we don't make any more money giving away 200 bushels of corn than we do giving away 50 bushels of corn. She said, well, that makes sense. Why do we do that? I said, we do it because we haven't been managing the marketing risk. We've been working on production risk, but not marketing risk. And then I got a chart from Dr. Hart, one of our agricultural economists up at Iowa State University. And he said, sometimes we make money on our crop. Here around 1972 and 73 and 74, we made money. Our cost of production was red, and what we sold corn for in Iowa was blue. We made money. For the next 3 years, we lost money. For the next 3 years, we made money. For the next 2 years, we lost money. Well, we broke even, and we lost money for 4 years, and then we lost money for 7 years, and then we made some money, and then we lost money, and we made some money, and we made quite a bit of money with the drought of 2012, and then last year, as a state, we lost money, and we're about to break even now. The cost of production and what we sell corn for since 1972 till now, you can't tell from the chart if we've made money on our corn or lost money in the state of Iowa. That's because it comes out within about a nickel a bushel of being the same, whether it was profit or loss. People have just been taking a chance. Where I put these red bars, these are the years that the cost of production was way up per bushel, because we didn't get very many bushels, but we spent the money to produce it. And in other words, these were the drought years. And the cost of production went up in 2 cases more than the price of the corn went up. And in the last case, the price of corn went up more than the cost of production that year. So all we've got to do is break out of that mold, know what the corn's going to be worth, or what the chance of it being at various levels is, and sell when we're above that level. Or at least sell the things at risk of being below that level. And we will come out ahead. Beans is the same, by the way. And we have exactly the same thing to deal with. Now let me look at these specific years just a little bit. Last year was a fascinating year, following 4 years of below trend yield. Remember I said we had 6 years of above trend crop yield in the United States. The first time we've recorded 6 since we started keeping record back in the 1860s. First time we've had 6 consecutive years of above trend yield. The most I know of in history was 7. I learned that in Sunday school when a fellow by the name of Joseph was sold into Egypt by his brothers, and he said we're going to have 7 years of record-breaking crops, which they did, followed by 7 years of drought, which they had. And I was wondering if we're going to have that same kind of biblical thing again. Are we in that kind of climate? Well, we had 6 years of high yields above trend, and then 4 years of below trend yield in a row. The 4 years in a row were because of the second strongest La Nina in recorded history. I mean, in modern recorded history, when we can put numbers on these things. The 6 years of above trend yield were dominated by El Nino. And there was a 70% chance every year that we would have an above trend yield. Last year was an interesting year. I drew an ellipse around the eastern states of the United States. It includes most of Illinois, part of Missouri, almost all of Arkansas, all of Louisiana, and everything east of them. Every state in that ellipse broke the state record for corn yield last year. above the record yield. Every state outside of the ellipse didn't make it to trend. They had a below trend yield. And that was everyone from Iowa to the state of Washington. Washington state still had 210 bushels to the acre yield. They led the nation, but it was below their trend. Washington state, I suspect, will always have the highest yield of any state. My daughter, who farms in Washington, said, "That's because we're better farmers than you guys in Iowa, Dad." And I said, "I guess you are." So I gave her a unit of corn seed. I planted 4 of those units, gave her 1. I said, "Go out and plant it." And she got about 2.5 acres planted with that unit of seed. I said, "You harvest that all by itself and tell me what you got." She called and said, "Dad, I got 240 bushels the acre on that unit of seed. What did you get?" I said, "I got 180. I told you we were better farmers. Why does Washington get more yield on the same hybrid than we get in Iowa? Is their soil better? No. Is the daytime temperature better? No. What's better? Nighttime temperature. What's the difference at night? Here it goes up to, let's say, 85 degrees in the day, goes down at night, down to 85, 75, 65. Drops about 20 degrees from day to night here. And in Washington, it drops 30 degrees from day to night. Daytime temperature about the same as we got in Iowa. So the corn grows about the same in the daytime as it does in Iowa, but nights are colder in Washington. And when nights are colder, what happens? I sometimes hand my students 6 apples, green apples. Say, put them on your countertop when you get home tonight. And then before you go to bed, put 3 of them in the refrigerator. When you get up in the morning, put all 6 of them on the counter again. Do this and come back in the week and tell me what the green apples look like. And say, well, the ones that stayed on the counter all week will be ripe, and the ones I put in the refrigerator every night will still be green. Corn does the same thing. If the night gets cold, it stays green longer. It takes it longer to get from silking to dent. And when it's got longer to get from silking to dent, and it's growing just as good in the daytime as it does anywhere else, it has more days to put on weight. In Iowa, with the warmer nights, and the warmer the nights are, the shorter the time from silking to dent, it's like cutting my steer short on feed. The number of days on finishing, it's going to finish light. The corn is going to finish light if it gets from silking to dent in fewer days. Colder nights will stretch out the time. We can only stretch it so far, and we hit the frost problem. That doesn't happen out in the state of Washington. They don't have their killing frost till December anyway. Well, all of these states, though, came in with below trend, and that made the nation below trend, even though all of those states set a new record. This year, I think, will be above the trend for the nation. You can write this down if you want to. Right now, my estimate for national corn yield is 169 bushels the acre. Remember, the trend is 160, about 9 bushels above the trend. Last year, we came out just between 1 and 2 bushels below the trend for our national yield. The people say, is Elwynn's number any good? And I say, no, it isn't. But for being above or below trend, I haven't been wrong since I started doing this in 1983. And so I suspect that I'm due to be wrong as well. Nevertheless, that's my number. This is the water, so far this water year. I say water year because water year is different than the calendar year. When does the water year begin? October the 1st. How come the water year starts on October? Because climatologists like to have 2 New Year's Eves every year. We start with New Year's Day, October the 1st, because any water that falls on our farm after October the 1st is building up the water for next year. The crop is gone, it's not using water, it's building up in the soil. Even where you still got green lawn, it's not using much water after we get into October. The water builds up till the next year. If we look at the water year up till now, there is the area that has had above normal water for the year to date. That will be from the northeast corner of Wyoming right up into Minnesota, and from that northeast corner of Wyoming right up to the northwest corner of Montana and on into Canada. That is the wet area, above normal. Also, there's some other places slightly above normal scattered around. Well below normal will be California and some of their immediate neighbors. And the bulk of the Corn Belt will be near normal, almost exactly normal, Illinois and Iowa. Normal precipitation for October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May. And because of that, our soils, which were out of water essentially by the time we harvested the crop last fall, have almost fully recharged with water. Some tiles were running by the time we got to the end of May. Some had never run over the winter. If you're from Iowa and have tiles, raise your hand. I want to see how many people we got from Iowa here that have tiles. Okay, I got 10 hands. If you looked at those tiles and found them to be running at any time and since last October, raise your hand again. 3 out of the 10. So I'll say that then 30% have found the tiles to be running, and probably that was in the last month. And it probably wasn't a great heavy running. There will be more today because some places got 4 or 5 inches of water in the past 36 hours. And everyone is close with the water in the top 5 feet of soil. Why do I say the top 5 feet of soil? That is the average rooting depth for both corn and soybeans in the state of Iowa. And in Illinois, by the way. Why is it 5 feet? Because that's about where we put the tiles. Why don't roots go deeper than the tiles? Some years they do. Why do they not go as deep as the tiles all the time? Because something's wrong. Either there's more moisture than the tiles can handle, and plants will only put the roots down until they hit free water. Then they quit. Not because they're satisfied. If you go out and dig a post hole in your field and you go down 2 feet and you see the post hole's full of water to down to 2 feet below the surface, how deep will the roots go? 2 feet and 1 inch. Why won't the roots grow more than 1 inch into the place where there'd be free water in the soil? Because there's no air there. And the air is just as important to the roots as the water is. Well, the tiles let the excess water out, so we got both things in the soil, air and soil and water. And the roots need them both. So 5 foot's the average rooting depth. The deepest corn roots that I have reliable reported measurements on from somebody who dug a hole by their corn is 9 feet 4 inches. I don't know if corn can grow longer roots than that under ideal conditions, but that's the deepest report I have. But the average is 5 feet. The crop needs 25 inches of water during the year to have a record high yield. It needs 20 inches of water to have an average yield. If it doesn't get its water, it can't get its full yield, because that's the way corn works. Soybeans work the same way. So we're about average water for this year. They got above average there. Places out here in the west, if they can't irrigate, are in deep trouble. Of course, most years they'd be in deep trouble if they couldn't irrigate out in that part of the country. So has anybody got any questions on what's going on with our water? The U.S. Drought Monitor says there's still a few places, and this was taken before this week's rain, that we're a bit short on moisture. And some places that are very short in Oklahoma and Texas Panhandle and Nevada and California. That is the Drought Monitor. The great drought that we've had for the last, well, so this is the 5th year, started in the east, moved to the central part of the country, Texas, and then the Midwest, and then to the West Coast. And this is the pattern of all great droughts. So it should about have run its course now and go to something less than a great drought. Right now, the past 2 weeks, it was dry west of my line that approximates the Continental Divide, and wet east of the Continental Divide. When the pattern divides on the Continental Divide, it's likely to stick, or more likely than other times. So we may have a situation of staying moist east of the Continental Divide, going dry to the west of the Continental Divide. We are moving into a situation called El Nino, water warmer than usual, off the west coast of South America. Now I suspect nobody can hear me very far away from me. Okay. I'll talk as loud as I can into this thing and compete with the entertainers. When the water is warmer than usual in this area, we have El Nino, the friend of the Midwest farmer, the enemy of the Australian farmer, the enemy of the Western Canada farmer, and the Washington State and Montana farmers. That's why when corn has a great year, wheat often has a poor year, because so much wheat comes from that area. When this goes blue in there, in cold water, then we have the La Nina, which isn't our friend, but it is the friend up Montana way. So a situation moving favorable. Will it become favorable in time to help the corn this year? Probably not. The beans, maybe. The last cutting of alfalfa, definitely. And next year, 2015, likely. So another year of above trend yields expected. We had a period of time dominated by La Nina and a tendency for crops, 70% chance in those years of being below trend, that dominated from 1950 to 1975. After that, El Nino dominated our world. We've just moved back to La Nina being the dominant factor. And it will probably stay for 25 years. This gives us a greater risk over the next 25 years than we had during the past 25. And this is a risk that we need to manage. It's a serious enough situation for this next 20 years that you need to manage risk. Your risk management practice of the last 10 years has been just that, practice. Now you need it. Now that it becomes high volatility. There's the years of the volatility, we already looked at them, of yields. Low years, low yields some years, high yields some years. Some years they go up and hit my dashed line, which is the yield that we get in the state of Iowa. I've got them for every state. If we have weather that's as good as weather ever gets. And if the yield doesn't go up and hit the dashed line, it is the weather's fault. Not on your farm. It might be because you let your junior do the planting for the first time. But if it's for your county or for your state, it's the weather at fault. Here were the years we called the benign years. We never had a bad year during that 18 years. We didn't have a great year. We had just good years. Never bad, never great, just good all the time. Fellow came into my office, 1967, seed salesman from the world's largest seed company at the time. And he said, Elwynn, what do you think of our new hybrids? I said, oh, they're just great. Why do you ask? Haven't you noticed we have consistent yields now from year to year? They don't bounce all over like they used to back in the 50s, and the 40s, and the 30s. I said, yeah, they really are good. He says, that's our plant breeding. We're independent of the weather now. We have these consistent yields. I said, do you really believe that? Yeah, I couldn't even find him in 1974. That's when we learned that weather that will cut the yield in half in the 1980s would have cut the yield in half there, and if we have it again, we'll cut the yield in half now. Yes, the crops are much better. Bad yields are better than record high yields were just 50 years before or 40 years before. Yes, thank you, plant breeders, but the plants are just as sensitive to the weather as they ever were. And your profits from agriculture don't come from whether you're down here or up here on the trend, they come from how much you deviate from the trend this year. The percent of trend is where the profit to the producer comes. Now, of course, it's a benefit to the world to have more food, but for money, it's the deviation from the trend. That is the thing we have to keep in mind, and the thing that we manage for. Let me point out one thing before I end here. This was 25 years of high volatility, 18 of consistent yield, 25 of high volatility, 18 of consistent yield. 2012 was the first year of high volatility that goes on for 25 years. If you don't want to manage risk and have great profit opportunities from it, land is selling pretty well now, it's a good time to retire. Other than that, take the opportunity to manage risk the way you wished you had back in the 80s. I wish you a very good year, and I'd like to thank these fine folks at the Checkoff for inviting me to be with you.